If you grew up in the 1970s, this video will remind you that it was a different time. In the 70s, there were fewer rules to follow, but that meant life was a bit riskier. Things that seemed completely normal gradually became illegal. Let's take a look at 15 things that were legal in the 1970s but are now illegal. But first, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video. Smoking cigarettes in grocery stores, hospitals, and airplanes. In the 1970s, black adults smoked cigarettes virtually everywhere without restriction. In grocery store aisles while shopping, in hospital waiting rooms while visiting sick relatives, and throughout airplane cabins during flights. Ashtrays were built into armrests on planes, placed on tables in restaurants, and positioned throughout public buildings. Smoking and non-smoking sections existed, but smoke didn't respect boundaries, filling entire spaces regardless of designated areas. The thing nobody tells you is that this ubiquitous smoking created secondhand smoke exposure that particularly impacted black communities, where public housing, crowded living conditions, and service industry jobs meant unavoidable contact with tobacco smoke. Flight attendants worked entire shifts breathing recycled smoke-filled air. Hospital patients recovered in rooms where visitors chain smoked. Children rode in smoke-filled cars with windows up during winter. What many overlook is that smoking bans that began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s represented one of the most dramatic public health shifts in modern history. Today, smoking indoors and public spaces is illegal nearly everywhere, with violators facing fines and businesses risking closure. The transformation from smoke-filled public spaces to smoke-free environments happened within a single generation, making the 1970s seem almost unimaginable to younger people who've never experienced entering a restaurant filled with cigarette smoke or sitting in an airplane cabin that looked like fog had rolled in. 2. Lead-based paint covering walls, toys, and children's furniture. Black families in the 1970s lived in homes where lead-based paint covered nearly every surface: walls, windowsills, doors, cribs, and toys. The paint made colors vibrant and surfaces durable, and nobody questioned its safety until children began showing symptoms of lead poisoning from chewing painted surfaces. Older urban housing, where many black families live, contained layers of lead paint applied over decades, creating particularly dangerous environments as the paint aged and began flaking. The thing nobody tells you is that lead exposure disproportionately affected black children living in older housing stock that white families had abandoned during white flight to suburbs. Landlords rarely addressed peeling lead paint, and families couldn't afford to remediate it themselves. Children playing near windows ingested lead dust. Babies chewed on painted crib rails, and toddlers put painted toys in their mouths, all while developing cognitive and behavioral problems that wouldn't be connected to lead exposure until years later. What many overlook is that lead-based paint was finally banned in 1978, but millions of housing units built before then still contain it, requiring expensive professional removal that many families can't afford. Today, selling or renting housing with lead hazards without proper disclosure is illegal, and lead paint removal requires licensed professionals using specific procedures. The legacy of 1970s lead exposure continues affecting adults who were children then, with studies linking childhood lead exposure to everything from lower IQ scores to increased incarceration rates, disproportionately impacting black communities. 3. Flame-retardant chemicals in sleepwear, furniture, and baby products. The 1970s saw flame-retardant chemicals added to virtually everything in black homes: children's pajamas, sofas, curtains, carpets, and baby products, all treated with chemicals designed to prevent or slow fires. Parents dressed their children in pajamas stiff with flame-retardant treatments, believing they were providing extra protection. Families sat on couches and slept on mattresses soaked in these chemicals, breathing their fumes and absorbing them through skin contact. The thing nobody tells you is that these flame retardants included toxic chemicals like PBDEs that that were later found to cause cancer, hormone disruption, and developmental problems. Black families living in smaller apartments with less ventilation experienced higher exposure as these chemicals off-gassed into their living spaces. What many overlook is that the furniture and clothing from the 1970s that families kept for decades continued releasing these now-banned chemicals long after their dangers were discovered. Many flame retardants used in the 1970s are now banned or heavily restricted, and products containing them can't legally be manufactured or sold. Modern safety standards require different approaches to fire safety that don't involve coating everything in toxic chemicals. But for those who grew up in the 1970s, the exposure already happened, with health effects that may still be emerging decades later. 4. Candy cigarettes, designed to look exactly like real tobacco products. Black kids in the 1970s bought candy cigarettes from corner stores, chalky sugar sticks packaged to look exactly like real cigarette brands, complete with brand name imitations and realistic packaging. Some versions came with powdered sugar coating that created fake smoke when you blew through them, allowing children to perfectly mimic adult smoking behavior. These weren't generic candies. They were deliberate replicas designed to make smoking seem normal, cool, and aspirational to children. The thing nobody tells you is that candy cigarettes were marketed specifically to normalize tobacco use among children, creating future customers for actual cigarettes by making smoking seem like a natural part of growing up. Black children, already targeted by tobacco companies through billboards and advertising concentrated in their neighborhoods, received additional exposure through these candy products. What many overlook is that candy cigarettes remained legal far longer than they should have, with concerns about encouraging smoking dismissed by manufacturers, claiming they were harmless fun. Eventually, regulations forced manufacturers to remove brand names and stop calling them cigarettes, rebranding them as candy sticks. Some jurisdictions banned them entirely. Today, products that explicitly encourage children to mimic smoking are illegal in many places, and packaging that resembles tobacco products is prohibited. But for black kids in the 1970s, candy cigarettes were just another corner store treat, part of the cultural landscape that normalized tobacco use in ways that contributed to the smoking rates that would affect their communities for decades. 5. Lawn darts with metal tips, designed to pierce the ground. Lawn darts, also called Jarts, were common in black backyards during the 1970s, providing outdoor entertainment that involved throwing heavy metal-tipped projectiles through the air toward ground targets. The weighted darts had sharp metal points designed to stick into the ground when thrown correctly, but they could also pierce human flesh when thrown incorrectly or when someone walked into the target area. The thing nobody tells you is that lawn darts caused thousands of injuries and several deaths before being banned, with children suffering puncture wounds, skull fractures, and fatal injuries from these supposedly recreational products. Black families playing in smaller urban yards faced particular risks, as limited space meant less distance between players and increased chances of accidents. What many overlook is that lawn darts were banned in the United States in 1988 after a particularly tragic death, making it illegal to sell them. Existing sets weren't recalled, so some families kept their lawn darts for years, either unaware of the ban or unwilling to discard a functioning game. Today, selling or distributing lawn darts is a federal crime, and modern versions use weighted bags instead of metal-tipped projectiles. But for those who played with real lawn darts in the 1970s, the game represented both exciting outdoor fun and genuine danger that nobody fully appreciated until the injuries and deaths forced regulatory action. 6. Leaded gasoline pumped at every gas station. Every black family with a car in the 1970s pumped leaded gasoline, breathing in toxic fumes while filling their tanks and driving behind vehicles that spewed lead particles into the air. Leaded gas made engines run smoother and prevented knocking, but it also released neurotoxic lead into the atmosphere where it was inhaled by everyone, particularly particularly affecting children whose developing brains were most vulnerable. The thing nobody tells you is that leaded gasoline created an environmental catastrophe that particularly impacted Black communities living near highways and in urban areas with heavy traffic. Studies have since linked childhood lead exposure from gasoline to lower IQ scores, increased aggression, and higher crime rates, with effects concentrated in communities of color who lived in areas with the worst air quality. What many overlook is that leaded gasoline was phased out slowly, beginning in the mid-1970s, but not completely eliminated until 1996. This meant decades of exposure that affected multiple generations. Today, using leaded gasoline in standard vehicles is illegal, and the fuel is unavailable at regular gas stations. The elimination of leaded gasoline is considered one of the most successful public health interventions in history, but it came too late for those who spent their childhoods breathing lead-contaminated air. 7. Clacker toys that could shatter and send plastic shrapnel flying. Clackers were enormously popular toys in the early 1970s, consisting of two hard acrylic balls on strings that you'd slam together to create loud, clacking sounds. Black kids played with clackers on playgrounds, in living rooms, and anywhere they could create the distinctive rhythmic noise that made the toy appealing. The goal was clacking the balls together as fast and as long as possible, creating continuous noise that drove adults crazy but delighted children. The thing nobody tells you is that the acrylic balls could shatter from repeated impacts, sending sharp plastic fragments flying into faces and eyes. Numerous injuries led to schools banning clackers, and eventually the Consumer Product Safety Commission deemed them hazardous. What many overlook is that the ban made clackers even more desirable, with kids sneaking them to school and playing with them in secret. The toy represented both the appeal of noise-making and the reality that toys weren't tested as rigorously in the 1970s. Today, the original acrylic clackers are banned, though safer versions using different materials have been produced. The clackers that Black kids played with in the 1970s are now collector's items, dangerous artifacts from an era when toy safety wasn't the priority it would later become. 8. DDT Pesticide, sprayed liberally around homes and neighborhoods. In the 1970s, DDT and similar pesticides were sprayed around Black neighborhoods, in yards, and sometimes directly inside homes to control mosquitoes and other insects. Communities near agricultural areas experienced crop dusting that sent pesticide clouds drifting into residential neighborhoods. Families used DDT-based products without protective equipment, spraying it around children and pets without concern. The thing nobody tells you is that DDT was building up in the environment and in human bodies, causing reproductive problems, cancer, and ecosystem damage that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Black communities, often located near industrial areas and subjected to more aggressive pest control due to perceptions about urban blight, experienced higher exposure to these toxic chemicals. What many overlook is that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 had warned about DDT's dangers, but the chemical wasn't banned until 1972, and similar pesticides continued being used throughout the decade. Today, DDT is banned in the United States, except for emergency public health situations, and its use anywhere requires extensive justification and oversight. But everyone who lived through the 1970s carries DDT residue in their bodies, persistent organic pollutants that don't break down, representing permanent exposure to a now banned substance. 9. Riding in cars without seatbelts or child safety seats. Black families in the 1970s piled into cars without seatbelts, with children bouncing around back seats, sitting on laps, or even standing in station wagon cargo areas while vehicles were in motion. Nobody wore seatbelts consistently because they weren't required, and child safety seats were rare and not mandated. Babies were held in adults' arms during drives, and toddlers sat unsecured on regular seats. The thing nobody tells you is that this created a public health crisis of preventable deaths deaths and injuries, with car accidents killing and injuring children who would have survived with proper restraints. Black communities, with less access to the newest safety information and equipment, continued these practices longer than wealthier white communities. What many overlook is that seatbelt laws didn't become universal until the 1980s and 1990s, and child safety seat requirements came even later in some states. Today, driving without proper child restraints is illegal everywhere, with specific requirements for different age groups and severe penalties for violations. Police can stop vehicles solely for seatbelt violations, and child endangerment charges can result from unrestrained children. The transformation from unrestrained chaos to today's strict requirements happened within a generation, making the casual approach to car safety in the 1970s seem almost criminally negligent by current standards. 10. Saccharin and Cyclamate, artificial sweeteners in diet foods. Black families trying to manage weight or diabetes in the 1970s consumed saccharin and cyclamates, artificial sweeteners used in diet sodas, low-calorie foods, and products marketed for diabetics. Tab, Diet Right, and similar diet sodas were sweetened with these chemicals, as were sugar-free candies and other products. The thing nobody tells you is that studies in the 1970s suggested these sweeteners caused cancer in laboratory animals, leading to warnings and bans. Cyclamates were banned in 1969, but saccharin remained available with warning labels until later studies questioned the initial cancer findings. What many overlook is that the saccharin scare created confusion about artificial sweeteners that persisted for decades, with consumers unsure whether diet products were safer or more dangerous than their full sugar versions. Black communities with high rates of diabetes particularly relied on these products, making the safety questions especially relevant. Today, saccharin is still legal, but has largely been replaced by other sweeteners, and cyclamates remain banned in the United States, though they're legal elsewhere. The 1970s sweetener controversy represented one of the first major public debates about food additive safety, with Black consumers caught between wanting lower-calorie options and worrying about cancer risks. Easy bake ovens with light bulbs that could cause serious burns. The Easy Bake Oven was a cherished toy in Black households where little girls learned to bake tiny cakes using the heat from a 100-watt light bulb. The toy worked by placing cake mix in small pans that slid under the bulb, where heat slowly cooked the batter. The thing nobody tells you is that the light bulb and metal surfaces got hot enough to cause serious burns, with numerous injuries reported over the years. The combination of real heat, metal surfaces, and small hands created genuine danger that parents didn't fully appreciate. What many overlook is that after multiple injuries, including one child whose finger was caught and partially amputated, the original bulb-heated version was redesigned and eventually replaced with a completely different heating element. Today, Easy Bake Ovens use safer heating technology that doesn't reach the same dangerous temperatures. The original 1970s version, with its exposed bulb and hot surfaces, would never pass modern safety standards. But for Black girls who used them then, Easy Bake Ovens represented independence and creativity, teaching them that they could create something delicious even if the process involved risks that modern toys are designed to eliminate. 12. Smoking sections in high schools and teachers' lounges. Some high schools serving Black communities in the 1970s featured designated smoking areas where students could legally smoke cigarettes during breaks. Teachers smoked in teachers' lounges and sometimes in classrooms after hours, creating environments where tobacco use was normalized and accepted as part of school culture. Students lined up at outdoor smoking areas between classes, and nobody questioned whether allowing teenagers to smoke on school property sent mixed messages about health and behavior. The thing nobody tells you is that these smoking areas represented the power of tobacco companies and how deeply smoking was embedded in American culture, so much so that schools facilitated teenage tobacco use. Black teenagers whose neighborhoods were saturated with tobacco advertising and whose communities had limited access to anti-smoking education became addicted during school hours with institutional support. What many overlook is that school smoking areas disappeared gradually through the 1980s and 1990s as smoking bans expanded and attitudes changed. Today, smoking anywhere on school property is illegal everywhere, with students facing serious disciplinary consequences for tobacco possession or use. The idea of schools providing smoking sections for students seems almost unbelievable now, but for Black teenagers in the 1970s, it was part of the school day as normal as any other activity. 13. Children drinking water directly from garden hoses. Black kids in the 1970s spent summer days drinking water straight from garden hoses, something nobody thought twice about. When you were hot and thirsty from playing outside, you just turned on the nearest hose and drank until satisfied. The water tasted like rubber and sometimes had a metallic tang, but it was cold and wet, and that's all that mattered. The thing nobody tells you is that garden hoses, particularly older models from the 1970s, often contained lead and other toxic materials that leached into the water, especially when hoses sat in the sun. Studies have since shown dangerous levels of lead, BPA, and other chemicals in water that's been sitting in garden hoses. What many overlook is that drinking from hoses created cumulative exposure to toxins that added to the lead paint, leaded gasoline fumes, and other environmental hazards affecting Black children during that decade. Today, hoses are labeled with warnings against drinking the water they carry, and products specifically designed for drinking water are made from different materials. But for kids who spent the 1970s drinking from hoses, the exposure already happened, contributing to the total toxic burden carried by that generation. 14. Asbestos insulation and tiles throughout homes and schools. Black families in the 1970s lived and worked in buildings filled with asbestos. Insulation around pipes, floor tiles, ceiling tiles, and roofing materials all commonly contained the fire-resistant mineral. Schools serving Black communities had asbestos-wrapped pipes running through hallways and asbestos tiles covering floors where children played. The thing nobody tells you is that disturbing asbestos releases microscopic fibers that, when inhaled, cause mesothelioma and other deadly lung diseases decades after exposure. Black workers in construction, renovation, and maintenance jobs had the highest exposure as they worked with asbestos-containing materials without proper protection or knowledge of dangers. What many overlook is that asbestos wasn't banned until the late 1970s and early 1980s, and buildings constructed before then still contain it, requiring expensive professional removal. Today, disturbing asbestos without proper containment and licensed removal is illegal, and selling products containing asbestos is banned. But the asbestos installed in the 1970s remains in many buildings, particularly in Black communities where renovation budgets are limited and older infrastructure persists. The health impacts of 1970s asbestos exposure continue emerging as people who were children then develop diseases from fibers they inhaled decades ago. 15. Playing on metal playground equipment that could cause serious injuries. Black kids in the 1970s played on metal playground equipment that got hot enough in summer to cause burns, had hard surfaces underneath that offered no cushioning for falls, and featured designs that created obvious hazards. Metal slides sitting in direct sun became so hot they burned bare legs. Jungle gyms stood on packed dirt or concrete, offering no protection when children inevitably fell. Merry-go-rounds spun fast enough to throw kids off, and seesaws had metal handles that could crack skulls. The thing nobody tells you is that these playgrounds caused cause thousands of injuries every year, with broken bones, concussions, and serious injuries considered normal consequences of outdoor play. Black communities often had older, more dangerous playground equipment that remained in use longer because parks serving these neighborhoods received less maintenance funding. What many overlook is that playground safety standards evolved dramatically from the 1970s through the 1990s, requiring softer surfaces, lower heights, and designs that minimized injury risks. Today, playgrounds must meet strict safety standards, and equipment like the tall metal structures and fast-spinning devices from the 1970s would never be approved. But for Black kids who played on those dangerous playgrounds, the risks were simply part of outdoor play. Injuries were badges of honor, and the equipment that could seriously hurt you was exactly what made it fun. These 15 things that Black families encountered, used, or participated in during the 1970s reflect how dramatically safety stance, health knowledge, and regulations have evolved over the past 50 years. What seemed normal then, smoking everywhere, lead in everything, dangerous toys and playgrounds, now seems almost criminally negligent. The bans and restrictions that came later represented genuine progress in understanding dangers and protecting health, but they came too late for the generation that grew up during the 1970s. Black families and communities often experienced greater exposure to these hazards due to living in older housing, working in more dangerous jobs, residing in more polluted neighborhoods, and having less access to safety information and resources. The cumulative health impacts of 1970s exposures continue affecting those who lived through that decade, with toxic residues, disease risks, and injury consequences that persist decades later. Understanding what was normal then but is illegal or banned now shows how much has changed, how much we've learned about protecting health and safety, and how the seemingly innocent activities of the 1970s carried risks that nobody fully appreciated until the damage was already done.